One of the main causes of the Spanish-American War was the concept of jingoism, or extreme nationalism. The 1890s was a decade of bad times and hardship at home. The Panic of 1893 hit the country hard, and Americans were struggling. Second, the idea of social Darwinism promoted ideas of racial superiority. Couple that with white man's burden, and Americans were eager to expand and spread American culture and democracy around the globe. The second cause of the Spanish-American War was the Cuban Revolution. Jose Marti and Maximo Gomez led a revolt against Spanish rule in Cuba. To put down the Cuban insurgency, Spain sent General Butcher Weyler. He rounded up the rural population into reconcentration camps, where they could not aid the armed insurgents. These unsanitary barbed wire enclosures led to thousands of deaths. News of these atrocities traveled to the U.S., and Americans were very sympathetic to the plight of the Cubans against their European rulers. News of the Cuban Revolution was reported by American newspapers, most notably the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, and the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. These two newspaper titans competed for readers all over the country. Their competition fueled something we call yellow journalism, the use of exaggerated or sensational headlines that bend the truth to attract readers. They both sent correspondents to Cuba to cover the war, but were unable to get reliable news and relied heavily on informants for stories. Many stories written in both papers were either elaborated, misrepresented, or completely fabricated by journalists to enhance their dramatic effect. Another cause of the Spanish-American War was the Delome Letter. It was a note written by Enrique de Puy de Lome, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, to the Foreign Minister of Spain. It revealed Delome's opinion about the Spanish involvement in Cuba and President McKinley's diplomacy. Cuban revolutionaries intercepted the letter from the mail and released it to the Hearst Press, which published it on February 9, 1898 in the New York Journal. Delome's unflattering remarks about McKinley helped fuel the country's aggressive, warlike foreign policy. The final cause of the Spanish-American War was the USS Maine. Early in 1898, President McKinley had sent the USS Maine down to Cuba to bring home American citizens in danger from the fighting and protect American property. It anchored in Havana Harbor. On February 15, 1898, the ship blew up. More than 260 sailors were killed. What caused this tragedy? Was it sailor error? Did Cubans and Jose Marti do it? This was a well-known tactic of theirs. They would destroy U.S. property in the hopes of drawing us into war with Spain. It possibly could be a Spanish mine. The New York Journal published this paper blaming the Spanish. They even offered a $50,000 reward for the capture of the Spaniards who supposedly committed the act. The nation was outraged. This was the last straw. The nation was finally ready for war. Remember the Maine became the rallying cry to go to war. There have been numerous investigations of the USS Maine since the explosion. In 1976, a team of American naval investigators concluded that the Maine explosion was likely caused by a fire that ignited its ammunition, not by a Spanish mine or act of sabotage. Even though Spain agreed to every U.S. demand, President McKinley went to Congress to ask them to declare war on Spain. They did so on April 20, 1898. The war did not start in Cuba like everyone thought it would. Instead, the first battle took place in the Spanish colony of the Philippines on the other side of the world. Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila, the capital, in 7 hours. This allowed 11,000 U.S. forces to join forces with Filipino rebels, who, like the Cubans, wanted freedom from Spain. Their rebel leader was Emilio Aguinaldo. The Spanish finally surrendered in the Philippines in August. Now let's focus on the war in the Caribbean. It started with a U.S. naval blockade of Cuba. The U.S. surrounded Cuba with its naval fleet. It didn't allow anything in or out. The Spanish fleet was sealed up at Santiago. Remember, the U.S. had the superior navy. Unfortunately, our army was much smaller. It was a small professional force that was supplemented by 125,000 inexperienced volunteers. They were ill-trained and ill-equipped. They were outfitted with heavy woolen uniforms even though they were fighting in the tropics. Teddy Roosevelt resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to help command the volunteer cavalry called the Roughriders. The Roughriders played a key role in the dramatic Battle of Kettle Hill. However, it was the Buffalo Soldiers, an African-American unit, who played a key role in the most important battle of the war in Cuba, the Battle of San Juan Hill. However, the American newspapers declared Roosevelt the hero of San Juan Hill. Less than 500 U.S. soldiers died in the battle. More than 5,000 U.S. soldiers died of malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the U.S. signed an armistice agreement. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, since it only lasted 16 weeks. Before the U.S. got involved with Cuba, Congress added the Teller Amendment to the Declaration of War. In it, the U.S. promises that it would not annex the island of Cuba after the war. On December 10, 1898, the U.S. and Spain met in Paris to sign the treaty. Spain agreed to free Cuba. Of course, the U.S. occupied Cuba for a while after the war ended and didn't leave until we convinced Cuba to alter its constitution with the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was very friendly to the U.S., even allowing for a provision that basically said we could intervene in Cuba whenever we liked. The U.S. acquired the islands of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam in the Pacific. Our military was in Puerto Rico like it was in Cuba. Congress passed the Foraker Act ending military rule and established a civilian government, making Puerto Rico a commonwealth. This means that it is not a state, nor is it its own country. They would become incorporated or come in as U.S. citizens as subject to the draft, but they cannot vote for president. Guam is a U.S. territory today. Finally, Spain sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. And it would be unincorporated, meaning they would never achieve statehood status. The end result of the Spanish-American War was that the U.S. was finally an imperial power. There were two competing visions in the U.S. at the end of the Spanish-American War. Americans were divided on what to do with the Philippines now that the U.S. had acquired the island chain. On the one side, you had expansionists who felt that the U.S. needed to compete as a world power. American businesses needed new markets to sell their goods. They believed that Germany or Japan would take over these islands if the U.S. did not step up and expand. Expansionists also had the support of the president. McKinley was a staunch expansionist and supported the annexation of territories like Hawaii and the Philippines. Finally, the argument for expansion was supported by the concept of social Darwinism and white man's burden. They felt that the U.S. had a duty to civilize and Christianize the Filipino people. On the other hand, there was a group of anti-imperialists who were very outspoken in opposition to the annexation of territories like the Philippines. They had many arguments against this expansionist policy. First, they argued that the Philippines was just too far away geographically to adequately defend against attack. The U.S. Navy couldn't possibly protect them, and the mainland U.S. at the same time. In addition, the federal government would have to raise taxes to support a larger military presence in Asia. Anti-imperialists also argued that American workers would be hurt by Filipino labor, which would drive down wages and take jobs from native-born Americans. Next, they believed that annexation should be decided by the Filipino people, not the U.S. government. Annexation goes against our traditional policy of isolationism, established by our first president, George Washington. Finally, they believed the U.S. Constitution and democracy would be incompatible with the Filipino way of life, making it very difficult to Americanize them. Here are the effects of the Spanish-American War. Number one, the Spanish-American War produced a strong sense of nationalism. It unified Northerners and Southerners, the first major event after the Civil War that brought the country together. Number two, the Spanish-American War made racism actually worse in the United States, affirming scientific racism and social Darwinism. Number three, after a victory over the Spanish, European powers recognized the United States as a major player with a strong navy. Number four, the U.S. opened new markets in Asia with an open door policy and also preserved Chinese boundaries. And finally, the U.S. and Britain became partners instead of estranged family members. This will be very important when we get to World War I and World War II. Here's a summary of the territories taken by the U.S. during this period. We already mentioned Alaska in 1867, purchased by the United States from Russia for $7.2 million. We also purchased Midway. This became the first atoll annexed by the U.S. government as the unincorporated territory of Midway Island, administered by the U.S. Navy. We also mentioned Hawaii, annexed in 1898. Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were acquired thanks to the Spanish-American War. Wake Island was annexed as an empty territory by the U.S. on January 17, 1899, as a planned telegraph cable station. Samoa was a coaling station at Pago Pago Bay, expanded to a full naval station. The United States will build a canal in Panama. The Virgin Islands. During the submarine warfare phases of World War I, the U.S., fearing that the islands might be seized by Germany as a submarine base, approached Denmark with a view of buying them for $25 million in United States gold coin. This is the equivalent to $2.2 billion today. The presidential election of 1900 was a rematch of the 1896 contest between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. The Democratic National Platform of 1900 had labeled opposition to the McKinley administration's expansionist foreign policy as the #1 issue of the campaign. In fact, presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan emphasized 3 major issues: free silver, anti-imperialism, and antitrust. His attack late in the campaign on increased military spending was related to the issue of imperialism. In the picture, Bryan's bellow, a joke on his long-windedness, and the puffing of Carl Schurz, a vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League, and Senator James K. Jones of Arkansas, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, are unable to ignite the fire of the imperialism issue. As you can see in the map, McKinley won re-election in 1900. As the Philippines fell to the Americans during the Spanish-American War, Filipinos declared their independence and proclaimed a provisional republic with General Emilio Aguinaldo as president. The U.S. rejected Filipino claims of independence, pushing both sides closer to conflict. Following the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, American reinforcements were sent to the Philippines. The Filipinos will launch a war they cannot win. U.S. forces quickly overrun the ill-equipped Filipino armies, but instead of giving up, they melt in the jungles and start guerrilla warfare. They will use barbarous methods against U.S. soldiers, who will return the favor. We did the same thing as Butcher Weiler did. We put Filipinos in reconcentration camps. After 3 years of fighting, over 4,200 Americans died, as well as over 20,000 Filipino combatants. As many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. Future President William Howard Taft will be appointed as governor and given the task of Americanizing the Philippines. He will conduct a very expensive infrastructure building campaign. A very successful school system will be created to teach all school children English, which will become their second language. But the Filipinos will be full of resentment until July 4th, 1946, when the U.S. finally grants them their independence. So let's summarize the development of U.S. foreign policy. From 1797 to 1898, our policy was isolationism, highlighted by the 2 major cornerstones of foreign policy, Washington's Farewell Address and the Monroe Doctrine. With the Spanish-American War, our policy changes to interventionism. The open door policy, remember, is Secretary of State Hay asking all nations with a sphere of influence in China to allow all nations to have equal trading privileges. After the Boxer Rebellion was put down by international force, including U.S. soldiers in 1900, Hay will issue a second set of notes to preserve China's territorial integrity and safeguard equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese Empire. This policy will strongly influence U.S. relations with Japan in the 1930s. In addition, we also have the Lodge Corollary, which states that non-European powers such as Japan should be excluded from owning territory in the Western Hemisphere.